Throughout the 19th century, long-distance air travel remained an unlikely dream. The aeroplane had not been invented, and hot air balloons, even after 100 years of development, could still not arrive at a desired destination, unless the wind blew in the right direction. But as the century turned, the best prospect for conquering the skies lay in gigantic, powered flying machines. The airships. They were the largest and most romantic aircraft ever conceived, pioneering intercontinental air travel and exploration to uncharted corners of the globe. Behind every giant, a story of passion and political intrigue. None more so than those that became symbols of nations. In the quest for global supremacy, they revolutionized warfare. And their story remains today amongst the most controversial in the history of flight. On the border between Germany and Switzerland lies Lake Constance. From across the globe, people pilgrimage here to experience the romance and adventure of lighter-than-air travel.
The magic, well, just that you're going at a slow speed, you just lean on the edge, and it all unfolds in front of you. You can smell the air, you can feel the air, and you get a view of the countryside which is supreme. You're in tune with the planet on which you were born.
No place has played a more important role in the airship story than Lake Constance. Located in the Kingdom of Württemberg, it was the setting for the dramatic story of the man whose name became synonymous with the airship. In 1838, on the shores of the lake, Ferdinand Graf von Zeppelin was born into a world of wealth, privilege, and revolution. As an ambitious young nobleman, he felt it his duty to serve in the military. And he distinguished himself as a cavalry officer in the Franco-Prussian War. But at the age of 52, his brilliant career was shattered. His forthright views on the Prussian military leadership saw him relieved of his command. He had no choice but to resign his commission.
A huge psychological blow to him, the man for whom the army was everything. The King of Württemberg realized that the Count had been unfairly criticized, and as a riposte to the central government and to the Kaiser, he immediately appointed him general in retirement. This, of course, was pleasant as far as the Count was concerned, but in no way made up for the huge psychological blow that he suffered. And from that day, 1890, he decided that he would seek to regain his honor by developing for Germany a war-winning weapon.
The idea for the weapon came partly from the American Civil War. As an official observer, he'd witnessed the use of tethered balloons to gather information on the movements of the enemy.
And he thought, magnificent, you could see what the enemy is doing. But he also, at that stage, thought, wouldn't it be even more magnificent if you could drop bombs for them? Well, if you're in the army, you're in the business of killing the enemy, I suppose. That's what it's all about.
In 1884, Zeppelin heard that the French army had developed a dirigible balloon, that is, one that could be steered. Powered by a primitive electric engine, it was the first aircraft ever to fly and return to where it had taken off. It was a military advantage for Germany's traditional enemy, which Zeppelin believed had to be answered. In the mid-1890s, the Count lobbied the German military. He wanted financial help to build a gigantic flying machine, an airship. The idea was not only met with skepticism, Zeppelin was derided as a fool. But his close friend, the King of Württemberg, considered him a visionary. The king provided land on the shores of the lake to begin construction of a weapon Zeppelin believed would make Germany the most formidable nation on earth. In late 1898, the Count employed local men to build an enormous floating hangar to house a flying machine unlike anything in existence. Without any engineering experience and without even making a prototype, he began constructing an airship more than 400 feet long, almost as big as a contemporary battleship. Unlike other dirigibles, it would have a revolutionary rigid frame made from aluminium. A cotton linen material covered the hull. 17 bags of hydrogen gas would provide the lift, and 2 small Daimler engines the power. In early July 1900, Zeppelin and his small crew removed their giant airship from the hangar and bravely set off into the unknown.
LZ-1 was 120 meters long, and it was by far the largest vehicle which ever had been in the air.
The first flight of a plane by the Wright brothers was still years away, but the airship's 3.5-mile flight failed to impress the German military. With his finances exhausted, the Count was forced to scrap the airship. But 5 years later, with funds provided by the King of Württemberg, he was back with a second, improved design. During its trial flight, the LZ-2 reached a maximum speed of 25 miles per hour. But she was dogged by engine failure. Hours later, after a forced landing, she would be completely destroyed by strong winds. Devastated by the loss and considered a laughingstock by the military, Zeppelin considered abandoning his airship project. But continued French successes haunted him. In 1901, Brazilian-born playboy Santos Dumont astonished Parisians when he wheeled his non-rigid or frameless airship through the streets and then took to the skies. Even more worrying was a novel type of airship made by Paul and Pierre Lebaudy. Built with only a partial frame at the bottom of the envelope, the so-called semi-rigid set a flight endurance record of almost 3 hours and was immediately purchased by the French military. Zeppelin publicly vowed to press ahead and both outdo his foreign rivals and silence his critics. But he needed money and mountains of it. With the help of a national newspaper correspondent, Hugo Eckener, he mounted a publicity campaign to capitalize on a groundswell of public sympathy that followed the loss of the LZ-2. Immediately, his fortunes changed for the better with the offer of the proceeds of a national lottery and a gift of 100,000 marks from the Kaiser. Spurred on by the support, Zeppelin set to work refining and perfecting his designs.
Count Zeppelin had one purpose in mind, and that was to give his country a stunning weapon that no other country could produce. And to that end, he bent all of his efforts. To him, that was the highest calling possible, was to serve his nation this way.
Over the next 2 years, the Count produced 2 spectacular airships. But would they convince the skeptics? Thousands of spectators flocked to witness their test flights. The airships were a stunning success. While no European aeroplane had taken to the air for longer than 15 minutes, Zeppelin's astonishing machines were flying for up to 12 record-breaking hours. Germany's military commanders finally expressed interest in Zeppelin's invention, but insisted it pass an almost impossible test before any orders would be placed.
The army demanded that there should be a 24-hour flight, 700 kilometers duration, before they would start to place orders for airships.
In 1908, the Count took up the challenge of the 24-hour flight.
Wunderbar. Wie ruhig die Motoren laufen.
It was an event which touched the heart of the nation and was later mythologized in a German feature film.
It travelled along the Rhine. Special newspaper bulletins alerted the German people to the progress of this astonishing contraption that filled the sky. And the experience was phenomenal. And it demonstrated itself when, with a motor defect, the ship was obliged to alight at Oppenheim. Thousands gathered and, without any orchestration, began to sing. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Engine repaired, ship took off. More unfortunate news. The ship was obliged to land at Echterdingen, near Stuttgart. The idea, of course, being that the damaged engine would then be replaced or repaired by the nearby Mercedes works. The Count that evening repaired to the local hotel, left the airship in the control of military who had been quickly summoned to the scene. Storm sprung up.
Kommen Sie.
Herr Graf, das Luftschiff.
Was ist? Reden Sie doch!
The airship was whisked into the air, dashed to the ground, burnt to a cinder. Then took place what can only be described as a secular miracle.
Without any prompting or any organization, people from all walks of life across Germany offered money to keep Zeppelin's airship dream alive.
Individuals, school classes, workers in the factories, and business itself. They contributed some 6 million marks, thus ensuring the financial future and the capability of developing future Zeppelins. The intriguing thing is the enthusiasm within the German people for this vehicle, this idea, and for the Count himself. Count
Zeppelin had become the most popular figure in Germany. a fact not lost on the nation's leader. The Kaiser travelled to Friedrichshafen and bestowed upon the Count Prussia's highest award and placed an order for a military airship. After 2 decades, Zeppelin's honour had been restored.
Count Zeppelin was a very religious man, and so he was convinced that he was chosen to build the airship.
Overnight, the Zeppelin company was transformed into the world's first military aircraft industry. Piece by piece, millions of parts came together to form the technological manifestation of German inventiveness and ingenuity. A spectacular symbol of aeronautic power that no other country could match. By 1909, the French had largely abandoned airships in favour of planes. But other inventors across Europe and America joined the airship race. Few could afford building large, rigid airships like Zeppelin. Instead, they constructed semi-rigid and frameless varieties with varying success. Some even offered joyrides to raise funds. It was an idea that hadn't escaped the Zeppelin company. In 1909, Zeppelin's business manager, Alfred Kolsman, decided to cash in on the popularity of the airship and begin taking passengers. Kolsman started the world's first commercial airline company, Delag, which would purchase new airships and offer flights between the nation's major cities. Zeppelin's brilliant publicist and advisor, Hugo Eckener, was soon flying the ships and overseeing flight operations. But the uncertainties of the weather made it impossible to schedule regular flights. Instead, it became more profitable to run short but expensive tourist flights over the countryside.
If you look at the cities where the airship stations were based, it was Baden-Baden, it was Frankfurt, it was Cologne, it was Düsseldorf, all cities where rich people were living.
But Delag had a disastrous start. Its first 3 airships made only 60 flights between them before coming to grief in accidents. Miraculously, no one was killed, and the lessons learnt forced improvements in airship design. Over the next 3 years, more than 10,000 passengers were carried over 100,000 miles in complete safety. But in the summer of 1914, the blossoming Zeppelin enterprise was curtailed by a catastrophe unparalleled in human history. At the outbreak of war in August, Germany and the opposing Allied nations of Europe boasted powerful armed forces. In its scope and horror, this war would be unlike any preceding it. A war in which technology would dominate. But at the outset of hostilities, the German military had only 8 operational airships. An urgent order was placed for dozens of new machines from Zeppelin and its smaller competitor, Schutter-Lanz. Both companies were forced to combine the best of their technologies and reduce construction time. As the war progressed, a new breed of larger super airship evolved, with more powerful engines, and lighter frames, made of a new aluminium alloy, duralumin.
War, as nothing else can, accelerated the progress. With the entire weight of the government behind building these ships and perfecting them, they were able to get the ships fine-tuned to a point that no one had.
With their extended range, the Navy believed airships would provide an advantage over Britain in being able to scout during naval manoeuvres and battles. But the Count pressed the military to use them as the spearhead of Germany's attack.
That Count Zeppelin revealed really his true colours. And he just wanted to annihilate the British, the big stumbling block in German progress and power-seeking, using the Zeppelin as a bomber.
Loaded with 5 tons of bombs, an airship, he said, would become a flying battleship that could strike at the heart of the enemy. The Kaiser initially vacillated over bombing Britain. Its king was his cousin. But from January 1915 on, he authorized missions unprecedented in the history of warfare. In the dark of night, Zeppelins would cross the English Channel and strike at British targets.
This is the birth of strategic bombing. This is the birth of modern total war.
Over the coming months, hundreds of civilians were killed or maimed in attacks across Britain and on London itself.
Suddenly, people began to feel vulnerable in a way that they hadn't done before. Warfare was spreading from the front line to the normal civilian houses. And this psychological effect was something that their owners were trying to achieve.
The British press, unsurprisingly, generated more anxiety using terms such as the baby killers.
The British government capitalized on the propaganda value of the Zeppelin raids.
When the airships raided Britain, of course there was sadness at death, but they were also said to be the best recruiting agent there had ever been. And so there were awful pictures of a bomb hitting, say, a woman and a child, and then being blown into the air and saying, "Are you going to stand by while this sort of thing is happening?"
Winston Churchill considered the Zeppelins easy targets. He mocked them as enormous bladders of explosive gas that Britain's newly developed fighter planes would easily destroy. But as British pilots discovered, the airships were better armed than they were. And hydrogen gas, though volatile, was almost impossible to ignite with conventional ammunition. Britain's armaments manufacturers set to work on developing special ammunition that would explode after penetrating an airship's gas cells. But Germany's daring airshipmen were determined to stay one step ahead of the British ground and aerial defences. They developed high-altitude Zeppelins, equipped with an observation car that could be slung below the clouds by cable and render the mothership invisible to the enemy below.
The Zeppelins came from above, from 6,000 meters, and then let down the observation car. And the crewman telephoned up and said, "Drop the bombs." And below they said, "That's impossible. There are no Zeppelins."
But the turning point came in late 1916, when British biplanes armed with new incendiary and exploding bullets downed 2 German airships.
There was a little cheer as the whole thing burst into flames. I was asleep at the time. That was the first thing. And they woke me up and said, "There's a Zeppelin on fire. Would you like to come and see it?" Well, it was the first time we'd seen any enemy aircraft at all. And to have one relatively close and to be caught up in flames like that, it's the scene that stands in my memory, I suppose, more than any other in my whole life.
The British had been terrorised for 18 months by the Zeppelins. But they recognised the bravery of the fallen crewmen of one of the airships with a full military funeral.
We learned that all the crew were burnt and they're buried at Potter's Bar. We didn't really think about the crew at all because there's no possibility that they could escape.
21-year-old pilot William Leaf Robinson was awarded the Victoria Cross for bringing down the first Zeppelin from British skies.
And he was celebrated as a national hero, and his face was in all the newspapers. There were postcards and posters produced. Everybody thought he was the greatest hero since Robin Hood.
As the war dragged on, growing numbers of airships on bombing raids across Europe and over Britain failed to return to base. One of the Zeppelins crash-landed in an Essex field, the captain setting his ship alight to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But it wasn't completely destroyed, and the remains provided the British with much-needed technical information for their own airship program. Indeed, from the outset of the war, the Royal Navy saw potential in the airship. But Britain was many years behind Germany in technical expertise. A handful of rigid airships were built, but played little practical role in the conflict. Far more important to the war effort was Britain's large fleet of blimps. Speed of construction was paramount. Using a simple frameless design, and by slinging the fuselage of an ordinary aeroplane beneath it, a blimp could be built and tested in less than 2 weeks.
The British really don't have a rigid airship capability, so they turned to the non-rigid airships. And they were used for a range of purposes. What they were most useful for was anti-submarine patrol.
By starving troops of ammunition and supplies, the German U-boat was proving an important weapon and a major strategic threat to Britain. But with as many as 100 blimps hunting them down, Britain began to neutralize the undersea raider.
And And a submarine of this generation, dived, is an immobile submarine. It can't continue its attack. And particularly in the context of convoys, if a blimp is escorting a convoy, that convoy is virtually completely safe. And so the blimps play an absolutely key role in the defeat of the U-boat in the First World War.
In March 1917, just weeks before America joined the war, Count Zeppelin died after a short illness. In Britain, the news of his passing was met with delight, while in Germany, the nation mourned. At his funeral, 2 Zeppelins flew overhead and dropped flowers as his coffin was lowered into the ground. Zeppelin's vision of the airship as an aerial bomber had been realized. But it had fallen far short of being a war-winning weapon. Hundreds of sorties over Britain had not resulted in any strategically valuable targets being destroyed. By war's end, the deaths of nearly 500 British civilians had been matched by a similar number of German officers and crew who had perished. But there was one consequence of the raids in Germany's favour.
Although the raids undertaken were not in themselves hugely significant, their contribution to the German war effort was in keeping from the Western Front thousands upon thousands of British troops, armaments, and aircraft.
At war's end, the victors met at Versailles to meter out their revenge on Germany and her allies. There appeared little doubt that all of Germany's surviving airships would be confiscated as war reparations. To prevent their beloved Zeppelins falling into enemy hands, some of the ground crews destroyed them in their hangars. At Friedrichshafen, the Zeppelin company braced itself for a bleak future. Its wartime workforce was cut from more than 13,000 to a few hundred.
In the wake of the First World War, the armaments industry in Germany clearly was letting go thousands upon thousands of people. Unemployment, industrial unrest stalked the Zeppelin works.
With the loss of its founder, Count Zeppelin, former publicist and chief pilot Hugo Eckener became the driving force behind the company's push for survival.
He had a very big challenge in front of him. The Zeppelin was hated by people around the world, and he had to get this whole subject of the military weapon and baby killer off the table as quickly as possible if he was going to be able to build ships and run a viable company.
Using leftover parts from the war, Eckener began building airships for Zeppelin's pre-war commercial passenger service, Delag. These new ships would not be for tourism, but purpose-built for domestic and ultimately international flights. The first airship, christened Bodensee, was the smallest but most beautiful Zeppelin yet created.
This was a source of enormous pride to the German in the street, who, through all the vicissitudes after World War I, down in Friedrichshafen, they were building these symbols and they were moving forward. And the force of will of Hugo Eckener was picking up from Count Zeppelin and carrying this thing forward.
Along with her sister ship Nordstern, Bodensee made daily flights between Friedrichshafen, Berlin and Munich, with almost every flight booked solid. But it was not to last.
And the Bodensee in particular was highly successful in providing a commuter service. However, the Allies perceived both of these airships, small though they were, as potential military airships.
Just as the Zeppelin company seemed to have put the war behind it, France and Britain demanded the new Deleg airships be confiscated as reparations for the war.
The most obvious consequence was that Germany was forbidden to either build or operate aircraft, including airships. It also provided for the destruction of the airship bases, the dismantlement of airship sheds.
For 2 decades, Lake Constance had been the home to the most famous symbol of German inventiveness. Now in desperation, the Zeppelin company was forced to retool its machinery to make aluminium pots and pans. The British were eager to deny Germany of airships, but not only as revenge for the war, they wanted to capitalize on their commercial potential. What was to come would stun Germany and capture the imagination of the world. Using design technology gained from downed Zeppelins, British engineers created 2 spectacular airships. At more than 640 feet long, they were 3 times the length of a modern 747, and the largest yet built. In late June 1919, the second airship, the R-34, was equipped for the first non-stop crossing of the Atlantic Ocean by aircraft. A few weeks earlier, a US naval flying boat had made the crossing to England, but with refueling stops along the way. On July the 2nd, the R-34 set off for New York from an airbase in Scotland. If she was successful, it would hopefully pave the way for a service linking the British Commonwealth with airships. 4.5 days later, the R-34 landed at Long Island, breaking the official world endurance record for powered flight.
While the R-34 drifted over the landing field, an officer descended by parachute to instruct the ground crew in the unfamiliar technique of hauling down the big airship.
Flying boats can hop their way across the Atlantic. The R-34 flies one way and comes back. The airship still rules okay, as far as range and endurance is concerned.
Using copied German technology, and thanks to the Treaty of Versailles, Britain could now lay claim to being the leading airship nation. But it was not to last. The United States was also eager to exploit rigid airships, but not for commercial reasons. The Navy wanted to employ them like Germany had during the war, as aerial scouts for its blue water fleets. In 1919, the Admiralty convinced the Congress to fund the purchase of 2 massive airships. But it was to be far from smooth sailing. First off the drawing board was the USS Shenandoah, the first American-built rigid airship. Like her British competition, she was a pirated copy of a German Zeppelin. In this case, the L-49, which was forced down in France during the war. But in terms of safety, the Shenandoah was unique. Rather than combustible hydrogen gas, she was inflated with helium, a non-flammable gas. The only known sources in the world were naturally occurring vents in Texas and Kansas. If it hadn't been for helium scarcity and America's reluctance to share it, the fate of many airships may have been completely different.
The Shenandoah became the first great American airship to ignite the public. People standing on rooftops, leaning out of windows, ships' sirens in the harbor, and an almost childlike glee at this wonderful new thing.
For its second airship, the US Navy went straight to the builders of the record-breaking R-34. The order came as a godsend to the British government. Budget cuts were threatening to force the scrapping of an airship being built at Cardington, the R-38. Now it could be completed and sold for a profit. There was even hope that the sale would lead to further American orders and establish Britain as a premier builder and exporter of airships. But the largest airship yet created was about to prove a disaster, not only for her builders, but for Britain's international prestige. In late August 1921, the newly completed R-38 set off on a final test flight into thickening fog toward the Humber River. Her design was a copy of high-altitude wartime Zeppelins. A lightweight frame allowed maximum performance in thin air. Her strength in heavy air at low altitudes had not been questioned.
Although we had made smaller airships and then advanced a little, we still didn't have that magic expertise. And I think that was the fundamental fault. We tried to get in on the act too fast. And then there was disaster. The R-38 broke up, apparently because people hadn't done the sums correctly, but the stresses involved when you turn a corner. For heaven's sake, you know, you're going to expect to turn a corner in airships. And then the thing broke in two or so and killed lots and lots of people. "44 of the 49 men aboard died in the disaster, including the chief designer and the cream of British and American airshipmen. Only one of 16 Americans survived. The memorial service was reminiscent of those following the sinking of the Titanic. The public mourned not only their airmen, but an overly optimistic faith in gigantic technologies. What the public didn't know was that Britain had shunned the Zeppelin company's offer to share its knowledge in return for their participation in post-war aviation. As Britain had discovered, it was a dangerous game for the inexperienced. And following the disaster, all work on British airships was suspended. The news of the crash of Britain's R-38 and America's need for a second airship were difficult for Zeppelin's Hugo Eckener to ignore. But under the Treaty of Versailles, Zeppelin was no longer allowed to build airships. America, however, was not a signatory to the treaty and was still owed an airship by Germany as reparations for the war. It was a loophole Eckener knew he had to exploit if Count Zeppelin's dream machine was to survive.
The great problem was to persuade France and Britain to allow such an airship to be built. Eckener, using his publicity skills, learnt as a student of the behavioral psychologist Wundt, articulated the idea that Germany should not be deprived of its livelihood and that it had every right to construct an airship. This did sit well with the government in Berlin, who feared that the activities and sayings of Eckener would upset the Allies to the disadvantage of Germany. But eventually, permission was forthcoming.
For both Zeppelin and Germany, this was likely to be the last opportunity to show the world the technical superiority of their airships. Indeed, she was designed to be the most extraordinary aircraft yet conceived. At 658 feet long and with a capacity of 2.5 million cubic feet, she eclipsed all before her. Her 5 12-cylinder engines theoretically could take her a quarter of the way around the globe without stopping.
It made a trip around Germany to show this wonderful ship off to the people of Germany, because there was no guarantee that they would be able to build another. This could have well have been the end of the Zeppelin story in Germany.
Excitement, amazement, idolatry almost emerged from the German people. They were proud of the new ship, but devastated that it had to be, as they saw it, given away to the United States of America.
In mid-October 1924, Zeppelin's brilliant new creation headed off into the morning mist, bound for America. For Hugo Eckener, it was the gamble of his life. The ship was uninsured, and he was obliged to lodge the company's entire assets as guarantee of her safe arrival. If she was forced down into the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic, there would be little likelihood of survival for Eckener and his crew. And it was far from an uneventful flight. Using his skills learned as a sailor, Eckener predicted atmospheric changes ahead that could have dramatically reduced his speed. If he maintained his course, the airship would run out of fuel. But Eckener continually adjusted his course and prevented disaster.
He became the world's greatest master of handling these very complex flying vehicles. His crew would say, if he says it's going to rain or there's going to be a storm, there'll be a storm, because the weather wouldn't dare be anything else.
"81 hours and 5,000 miles later, the airship, soon to be named Los Angeles, cruised over Manhattan. She had completed the fastest journey, either by air or sea, between the old and the new worlds, and along with the Shenandoah, crowned the United States the leading airship nation.
It was one of the great airship transoceanic epics. It was covered in great detail by the press as the magnificent thing it was. And it arrived in Lakehurst, New Jersey at the new airship facility there, the Naval Air Station. And Eckener became overnight a heroic figure in America who probably did as much toward healing the wounds between the two countries as any single figure could have done. Even his government had to recognize that Eckener had done something for the country that no one else could really have done.
Dr. Eckener was the hero figure of the hour, and by extension, so was Germany reinstated amongst the nations of the world.
In the wake of Eckener's success, the 1920s was to usher in a glamorous new era for the airship. and spark intense rivalry between nations for airship superiority. Intrepid Italians would set off to explore uncharted corners of the globe. And the British would attempt to re-emerge from disaster with two massive airships designed to connect the far-flung outposts of their empire. But it would be the dramatic attempt by Germany's Hugo Eckener to fly around the globe that would grip the imagination of millions, and, if it succeeded, write a stunning new chapter in aviation history.